I now call on Stewart Stevenson to wind up. Minister, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and may I thank, as others have, Mary Scanlon for the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. And may I share the admiration that others have expressed for Andrew and Susan Banks and the efforts that they've made in their service. Let me try and address, in the time available, one or two of the points that have been made. I think Mary Scanlon said Pentland faced a cash competitor with limitless taxpayer funds. Actually, the contract very tightly constrains the funding that's available. I don't think that necessarily negates the general point, I think, that was being made, but it certainly ought to tidy up the particular expression of the point that's being made, even if it is in the book. It is not true.
I just
Scanlon.
Deputy Presiding Officer, that was a quote from Lord George Robertson.
Well, I'm sure the official report will recognise from the source that having been put on the record. But the contract does constrain how things actually happen. The Pentland is, of course, a different design of vessel from the Ham Navaux, a more modern design that would not have necessarily been available at the time the vessels that Northlink procured were taken into service. And I think that reflects a general point that, of course, over time, designs change and designs can improve. The Pentland, of course, is something that's run by a private company. We don't have access, as we do for Northlink services, to figures about reliability, neither do we exactly know the carryings that there are. Probably it's of the order of about a quarter of the traffic. Although I did hear what was said that some 80% of freight and 80% of sheep, Charlie Gordon was suggested, were carried by Andrew Banks. I don't have information that would rebut or endorse that one with the other, but I certainly note it as an interesting point to have made. Mary Scanlon highlighted tourism as an important industry for Orkney, and of course that is the case. She also highlighted that the subsidies for Northlink have risen, and indeed the ferry budget as a whole has continued to rise. In particular, fuel costs are now an increasing proportion of the costs of operating ferries, and that has been reflected in the subsidies that we have to provide. And it is worth at this point just making the very general point that while there are routes in Scotland that are capable of commercial exploitation, they are very much the minority in terms of the number of routes, if not necessarily the minority in terms of carryings, because clearly it's routes with the largest carryings that offer commercial opportunities. And in the ferries review, we are not discounting that there are many different approaches to providing ferries and not simply being provided by the state. Jamie McGregor.
I thank the Minister. While we're on the subject of routes, has he any news on the Campbelltown-Ballycastle link?
I suspect, given the terms of the motion, Presiding Officer, it would be inappropriate for me to respond to something that's clearly outside the route. But I do recognise and understand the member's continuing interest in the subject, and I met him recently, and I can say the matters we discussed are progressing. But these were matters I discussed in confidence with the member. Rob Gibson made the point that Pentland Ferries have made a success. Absolutely correct. I'm not, of course, in detail familiar, as perhaps Liam MacArthur and Rob Gibson are, of the difficulties that were experienced with Orkney Islands Council in the provision of harbours. I don't find Orkney Islands Council behave in an irrational way, but it's certainly something I'd be interested to hear more about later. Dave Stewart talked about the difficulties of synchronising the changeover between summer and winter timetables. It's actually more fundamentally difficult than he even described. Airlines worldwide have a common date worldwide at which they swap from summer to winter timetables. I have tried, but not yet succeeded, in trying to persuade the train operating companies in the UK that it would be useful if we aligned the dates to there, because clearly we're not going to get the airlines to change worldwide, and similarly to get bus and other operators. It is a subject we'll continue to engage in, but it is formidably difficult, and yet it sounds so simple to achieve, and it's a very obvious point. Talked about the common design of vessels. That is something we're working with the Northern Ireland Executive and the Irish Republic on, using European money to build common designs so one can, in effect, order from a catalogue instead of having to design every vessel that you want. One of the disappointing things is that at the moment there are no UK yards at all bidding for ferries. None at all. To the extent that when we went with the Islay ferry, I actually phoned up managing directors to make sure, to find out why no bid was coming from them, and I'm afraid I don't see any early change to that. Lee MacArthur talked about, unless I'm going to be a little...
Very briefly, Mr. Stewart.
Very briefly, I'm grateful for Mr giving way. Does the Minister recognise that one of the problems in vessel commissioning across the world was the scarcity of engines? And this is now actually getting slightly better in the world market, which should help speed up the commissioning of new vessels.
Minister.
Yes, at the Fairley Yard, that was one of the fundamental issues that prevented their bidding for the Islay contract, that the vessel would have had to sit complete on the slip for a year before they could get the engine. So it is a very good point that the member makes. He's clearly on top of this, and I do understand it. Lee MacArthur pointed to the loyalty of Pentland Ferries customers. I think Andrew is very much to be commended, Andrew Banks, for the work that he's done. I would say when we had to remove the Hamnavo to rescue people from across the UK, and indeed even further from Bergen, to repatriate them to the UK mainland, something that was very welcome by those who were rescued, that it was clear that at that time of year, Pentland Ferries could pick up the service. Let me absolutely agree, Presiding Officer, that Andrew Banks is to be commended for his entrepreneurial spirit. Let me point out to everyone and encourage everyone to engage in the Ferries Review, which is something we've been doing informal reviews going out to communities over recent months. We will produce a document for consultation shortly. It has been to my, let me just say, it's been to my desk once. I have requested some changes, so we are in the final stages. But given that it has to be approved by other ministers, I'm not in a position to make absolute commitments as to when it will be. But clearly, with the large number of ferry routes we have, an entrenched way of working, it is time to look again at how we do our ferries, but more fundamentally to look at actually what communities need in the way of transport. Because in some cases, roads might substitute for ferries, if you do it right. In some other cases, air links might be better to be improved rather than ferries. So we don't just look at ferries. Ferries serve an economic and social purpose for communities. There may be other ways of delivering that. Let's open our minds to a wide range of possibilities. Make sure we all engage in the most useful and open-minded way on that subject. And I very much look forward in due course to bringing the results of that consultation and discussion to Parliament. Presiding Officer.
I now close this meeting.